Thank you. Okay, so to end this Blue Peter birthday week, we thought we'd try something new on the group, and we're going to have a nice chat, hopefully, with Richard Marson. I'm sure you all know Richard. He worked on Blue Peter for 10 years, four of those as of the editor, and he's also the author of some fabulous books, the Blue Peter Diaries and the Biddy Baxter, the woman who made Blue Peter, which I'm sure most of us have got copies of. Okay, Richard, if we could start off by having a little chat about Biddy first. Obviously, we were all
Great
saddened.
lady.
Yes, we were all saddened to hear of her passing towards the end of the summer. I know she was a dear friend of yours, so if you wouldn't mind just sharing a little bit about Biddy, the lady that you knew, and obviously a time that you worked with her over the years.
Well, I'll tell you, my first encounter with Biddy was when I was a floor assistant, which is the most junior role on the studio floor. And it was in her last year, and I was marking up what they called idiot boards, which in those days the presenters didn't have autocue, so they had to learn the script. And that meant that sometimes, especially when there were lots of facts, they really needed a little prompt. And that would be the job of the junior member of the team to write them out with a kind of on a big piece of caption card using a marker pen. And Karen Keating had got me, the late great Karen Keating had got me to go and write out this paragraph, which was, I think, a link into a film. And Biddy, I suddenly was aware of the click, clack, click of the heels, and she was standing over me. And what are you doing, darling? And I said, oh, I'm just doing this idiot board. And she said, I pay her to learn her script, and off she went. But she didn't really object. I mean, I think she was making a point, but that was my first thing. And of course, she was very much talked about, and I'd grown up with that name, like so many other
Yes.
children. I'd grown up with the alliterative name on the end of the credits. Um, but as I got to know Biddy, I knew Biddy for a quarter of a century, and I first came into my orbit when I was producing or setting up to produce the program to dig up the box of slime for the year 2000. And she took an interest in that. And Steve Hocking, who was my predecessor and colleague at that time, he gave me that because he knew I was a big Blue Peter fan. And he thought, oh, well, it had been in safe hands with me. But also, I think because he thought I could manage the old talent. And there was this whole concern that if we brought John Noakes and Peter Purvis back and we had Biddy and Edward, there might be a punch up. So there had to be a sort of tactful way of, because there was going to be a big lunch after the filming. Anyway, that all went well, and I think she was always one to spot someone who she and Edward used to talk. They nicked that phrase from Margaret Thatcher. They would say, "Are they one of us?" And that meant, did they understand Blue Peter or not? And it didn't mean that you had to do Blue Peter the way they'd done it, but there was something about the understanding of the prepubescent audience and not wanting it to be necessarily the coolest show on earth, because as they always say, something that's in fashion goes out of fashion. You're better off being slightly uncool, but knowing what you are and what your identity is and sticking to that. Um, and she was very loyal. I mean, I very didn't agree with everything she said. Often we would have quite heated conversations because she'd phone you up after a program and say, darling, what on earth were you thinking with such and such? Sometimes she was right, sometimes she was really, really wrong. And sometimes I couldn't resist saying, well, Biddy, frankly, you had a captive audience of 11 million people. You could pretty much put someone reading the phone book on, and sometimes you almost did, and
Yes. Yeah.
and get away with it. Whereas nowadays, the competition, the pressure in television is so intense. We were really, aware of the need for every show to kind of punch above its weight. And I think that's true of anyone making TV in a multi-channel, highly competitive era. And of course, that wasn't her era. So she did sometimes struggle to understand that. I mean, I once booked at her behest. I didn't really want to book it, but she did a big Biddy number on me, and it was one of her music trust students, and they were a very brilliant classical violinist. But honestly, classical music is not top on the list of things that children love to watch. And my team were like immediately like, "Oh, what have you landed us with this for?" And I was like, "Look, sometimes you have to just, do someone a
Yes.
favor." And I said, they are a very bright young talent. And, maybe in years to come that clip will be shown because they're conducting the last night of the proms or something. Anyway, we booked them, and I did in a cowardly way, put them right at the end with the credits playing over them, because I thought, well, by the end, we've got 23 minutes into the show. It doesn't really matter if someone turns off at that point. But of course, Biddy knew exactly what I'd done, and she phoned me up and gave me a right earful and said, it was very disrespectful to the artists, running the credits over them and da 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 da. And again, you have to stick to your guns. And she did admire that. I mean, I don't think with Biddy, she ever respected people who just rolled over. And there were some extraordinary, I've seen it many times, of people being kind of Uriah Heepish around her. And that would actually bring out the worst in her, because she couldn't really bear that. She liked people who had talent, who could hold their own, and who loved Blue Peter and cared
Yes.
about the audience. I mean, to her, the audience, was everything. I think I said in the book that, she used to talk about having 9 million friends. And it was quite Enid Blyton-esque and simplistic in some ways, but it was nonetheless sincere. And, that meant that she was exceptional. She obviously had no interest in doing anything other than Blue Peter, which meant that because she finished on Blue Peter when she was only 55, she did do other things, obviously, but really she remained this kind of matriarch in the background, and different editors had different ways of dealing with it. I mean, Oliver, who was another of my predecessors, had worked for her. So he, was fond of her, and they had an easy relationship. Steve Hocking respected her hugely and understood that it was important to kind of keep her on side, because Biddy had a hotline to all the press and all the rest of it. And if she wasn't on side, she could cause a lot of problems. I loved her anyway. I mean, I just found her hugely entertaining and also very wise. So as much as I didn't agree with everything she said, it's quite a lonely job being the editor of any program or magazine. And there aren't that many people who really get the different pressures that are involved. And she obviously did. So when I had lunch with her, which I did periodically, that was always a really useful time, because I knew also she could be trusted. She was very discreet. So you could, I mean, she wasn't discreet when she was talking to you about whatever, but between the two of us, I knew she would be very on side and supportive, if sometimes critical. And that was very valuable. After I went, I think that for a period of time they sort of thought, oh, we don't want this, old dragon around. They kind of, and that meant that she would then became a bit of a loose cannon and started to say things which she felt at the time. I mean, she did say to me after the 60th program, she said, I don't know why they don't put it out of its misery, because I think she felt very strongly that the BBC had only kept it going because they couldn't face the row of cancelling it.
Yeah.
And she said, once you've cut it down to one show a week and it can no longer do the big appeals, the big expeditions, she said it's a shadow of its former self. And I think that grieved her, because it was her baby,
Yeah.
in a way that I don't think Edward, who, if you like, if she was the mother, he was the father. I think he was more pragmatic and more able to accept that the world has changed, and in a way it's a miracle that Blue Peter is still there in any form. But I think she did feel keenly that the BBC were kind of keeping it on for the wrong reasons, really. And she still never lost her touch in terms of some of her lessons, which aren't that fashionable now, among TV professionals. If you talk to viewers, like now there's wall-to-wall music on everything. And that's actually something that viewers often complain about,
Yeah.
because it's sort of like an oral bombardment. And actually, she understood the power of quiet and silence. So when you've got a presenter doing a make, nowadays there's music all over it, as far as I can tell. But we never did that. And that was because it was a really intimate moment between that presenter and the viewer. And that had real value. And yes, you might then go into a really noisy action film or a band or something like that. But it was what we always called light and shade. And now it does seems to be light. There's a kind of fear, I think, which is across all modern TV. Oh, if we've got someone watching, we've got to be very smiley and shouty, and everything's got to be amazing. And we've got to have music going, and we've got to have, yeah, and we've got to have, I mean, she loathed having children in
Yeah.
the studio as what she called props. She thought if children were in the studio, they should be there for a reason. I didn't always agree with that. Sometimes I thought it was nice to have an audience of kids. gave it a bit more atmosphere.
Yeah.
And equally, I would say that sometimes, especially under her era, kids who were on the show were very stilted because they were rehearsed too much, and it was very hard to make that natural, compared to other children's shows. Anyway, to cut a long story short, she was an extraordinary woman. I mean, it's kind of like, well, you can quickly run out of hyperbole for her. But on a personal level, I admired her intellect, her single-mindedness, her devotion to the audience, her loyalty to her friends, and her eccentric personality and sense of humor. I mean, I love the fact she peppered her conversations with C words and F words. I used to call her Miss Marple on acid because by the time I knew her, she had this rather grand dame image, but she was certainly not stuffy. And she was probably a bit of a snob, in the nicest possible way, in that she saw no problem with celebrating quality in the best. So for her, the best music was opera or classical music or high church music, or good literature, or she loved good food. She liked things to be the best. When she traveled really well, very kind of elegantly and quite adventurously. She was a great friend. She took a real interest in if you had children or grandchildren, or she had godchildren, she was properly engaged. She wasn't just, she didn't want children herself, but she yeah, she was a really, really good friend. And I was sad, but also relieved that she died when she did, because she had lived to see, if you like, the book was the final accolade.
Yes.
And she was able to hold that in her hands and to understand that there was a lot of love for her. And she'd had obviously various gongs and tributes and things, but that was a kind of, the final culmination. And as my mother used to say, getting old is not for the faint-hearted. And I think Biddy would echo that. She had to deal with a lot of illness and infirmity. Her mobility was very limited. And this was a woman who was just charged with energy and electricity and wanted to get out and do things. So for her, even though it was great, she was in her own home, she couldn't get out and about
No.
anymore. And in the final years, when her mobility was getting steadily more and more of a challenge, I often used to sort of almost have a tear in my eye because of that bravery. I would see her coming towards me, in Great Portland Street, walking with a stick, still festooned with bags, and still sort of indomitable, and she just didn't want to give in to any. It was boring to her. She didn't want to talk about
No.
health or any of those things. She wanted to talk about whatever the big broadcasting story was, or the big current news story was. You won't be surprised that she gave short shrift to many senior figures, both in politics, in the BBC, and all. And she was able to back up her arguments. So yes, she was just great company, and I admired her hugely. I kind of loved her really, and I always thought as well she belonged to an era where nowadays everything is so black and white. If you don't agree with someone, they get cancelled or you want them cancelled. Whereas with Biddy, there was plenty of stuff she said and thought that I didn't agree with, and vice versa. But so long as you had enough common ground, that didn't matter. And actually, that made things more interesting. So yeah, she was amazing, a remarkable woman.
Yeah. Yes, a lovely lady, a wonderful lady. I met her very, very briefly at the 60th, and she signed your 50th birthday book.
Oh, jolly good.
So that was something nice to keep.
Jolly good.
So if we move on now to your time on the show program, do you call it show or program?
Either work.
And
I
think Biddy would always call it program. Is that correct?
Yeah, she was keen on it being it was the program.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now I might be wrong in what
I would talk about the show, meaning an individual episode.
Yes. Okay. I might be wrong with what I'm about to say now. I think you're a lover of a song and dance routine.
Oh yes.
Am I correct?
Yeah, I mean more so than many of the presenters, poor things. So I used to torment them every year.
So if we could particularly talk about some of the Christmas specials. You weren't editor when you did Club Blue Peter, were you?
No, I was the series producer, yeah.
But you were when it was totally Blue Peter, is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah. So just tell us a little about what went on in the background, behind the scenes on those sort of things.
Well, I mean, I should pay tribute to the fact that, Blue Peter had done musical Christmas extravaganzas, which I'd very much enjoyed.
My favourite was always Mark Curran and Yvette. Yes,
Exactly. And I
yes, yeah,
loved them. I was a
yeah,
floor
yeah,
assistant in
yeah,
that time and really
yeah,
loved that team. I thought they were a great team. And, Karen Keating doing There's a Million Kinds of Coffee in Brazil and things like that. And putting on the Ritz with Mark and Yvette. I loved that. And I really liked Dave Cook, who, as you know, is married to Tina,
yes,
one
yeah.
of the presenters. And I mainly worked with his other MD, which was not my choice. I was told by the editor when the first one I did, they wanted me to use this particular guy who's really talented. But Dave gets it in a way that, like when I said to Dave Cook for Christmas at the Club Blue Peter, I want to do a Bollywood version of that Christmas song by, was it Slade? I think it was Slade. And
Yes,
he said, I want to do a Bollywood version of a Slade song. And he had to do about 3 or 4 versions and mixes before I was happy. I said, no, 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 you've got to have more sitars in it. You've got to have more. And in the end, I called it Christmas at Woolworths because, we made it look so glittery and orange and red and all the rest of it. And Connie, in her outfit, and Matt and brilliantly dancing. I mean, the thing was, it was it was sometimes tricky because not all those presenters had the skills. So you had to try and work with that. But I wanted them to have a good time. I didn't want them to get to Christmas, which is a really hard time of year on Blue Peter because there's so much going on.
yeah,
When you were doing one of those shows, that was like a lot of extra work, usually at weekends and in evenings and all the rest of it. And often everyone was getting sick. So you wanted them to kind of relish it. So I used to work really hard to come up with a story that I thought they'd really enjoy playing. And I always thought that the audience would enjoy that. And of course, not everyone in children's management agreed. I mean, my boss in the last year, it was very straight down the line kind of ex-news sort of person, just didn't get it at all, and said to me, "Oh, totally, but it's set in the 80s. Children won't get what that is." And I said, "Well, they don't get what Queen Victoria is, but we bang on about her all the time." I said, like they're not stupid children. They are, especially in the internet age where they can just Google something. I said they get the references. And by that point, music was getting more democratic. Kids were listening to all kinds of stuff. Nowadays, of course, they really are they listen to anything on Spotify or whatever. Um, so there had to be a coherent narrative that was funny and had, and I just used to rip things off. I think Christmas at the Club Blue Peter was a kind of medley of Moulin Rouge, and Singing in the Rain, and Some Like It Hot. And and Christmas, what do they say? Campers Christmas. I always thought that you could go quite a long way. You could be. I mean, I look back at Christmas at the Club Blue Peter now, and I mean, my family never let me hear the end of it. If there was anything raunchy or saucy on TV, they go, "Oh, Dad, it's one of your pantos." And I did have to answer for my crimes to Nigel Pickard, who was there. He was incredibly supportive. He commissioned it, and it was the biggest budget we ever had. I mean, it was really quite well resourced. And I remember him saying in the edit when I was showing him the first cut, I showed him Liz doing those boots were made for walking, and he was sort of like gulping and saying, I can see there's going to be a lot of complaints about this. He was going on about stockings and suspenders. And I said, well, I've got two things to say, Nigel. One is a Blue Peter viewer designed the costume that Liz was wearing, and that really got us that we dodged a few bullets with
yeah.
that because you just stop people, you shut them down when you said actually it was a 12-year-old boy that came up with that outfit. I'd love to meet that boy. I'm sure he had interesting influences. But so that was helpful. But also used to say Saturday afternoons, the BBC were often showing Technicolor musicals that were far,
Yeah.
saucier and had women in outfits just as glitzy and glamorous and all that. And I just thought, it's a bit of fun. We were already moving into this slightly censorious world we're in now, where everything has to be sort of, it's like, oh, well, that's not suitable, that's inappropriate, and you're kind of getting shut down. And luckily we were allowed to play. Then there was a number, Simon singing "I'm Still Standing" in a boxing gym, and with loads of half naked boys. And again, Nigel said that's going to be an instant gay classic. And my argument to that was, well, they are a sizable portion of your audience. So why aren't they entitled to have a music number that they're going to appreciate more? And I used to also know that the child audience of Blue Peter was mainly prepubescent. So they weren't thinking. So that also meant that sometimes, in the same way when we book bands, I'd be thinking, yeah, Atomic Kitten are fine, but maybe uh what were they called? The All Saints were a bit more sophisticated, a bit raunchier. The lyrics were a bit darker. Maybe they weren't so suitable. So you were trying, so in your song choices, you had to, make kind of choices. I mean, now I probably look back when Liz was doing Venus dressed as a red devil with an outfit that came from a sex shop, I later discovered. And I was like, oh dear. And that we had to recut because I had gone onto the set and the costume designer had given the boys like they were like breeches under the down to under their knees. And I just thought they looked ridiculous. I mean, they just had collars and cuffs like the Chippendales. Um, and again, it was partly that thing of if we're going to make the women do these pastiches of kind of glamorous videos and Hollywood stuff, then, why should the boys get off? But I had them shortened. And yeah, suffice to say, Nigel also was slightly worried about that. So we cut away from. And the thing with hiring professional dancers, if you've got Blue Peter presenters, it immediately makes it safe.
Yeah,
And especially because they're a bit crap. I mean, they would say in the best will in the world. I mean, actually, Liz wasn't. She was a brilliant performer. She had a kind of chameleon-like ability to switch. So she'd be saying to me, "I can't do it. I can't do it. Oh, I feel ridiculous. I feel stupid." And then you go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and she'd just suddenly transform, and she'd be like vamping it up, and you're like, "Where did that come from?" Um, Actually, I think that's true of probably lots of performers, that there's part of them that says, can't do this, can't do this. But when the red light's on, suddenly they can. But, someone like Simon, he really didn't like jigging about and he did it and he joined in with and he had some fun with it. But I would say that, Matt was a natural actor. Matt was going to be an
yeah,
actor. He became a presenter, but really he's an actor. And that's why I often gave him a double role because I knew he could do it, and B, he'd really enjoy it. And he was just brilliant, brilliant, brilliant to work with. I mean, we just howled with laughter so much. I mean, we used to do this thing that the editor made for Christmas at the Club Blue Peter a kind of making of package like the ones you would get on a DVD, which had lots of outtakes, but also had Matt in pretending doing interviews, pretending to be this very camp American who was playing the in the show, and he'd be like, "I have an assistant called Stacy, and she hovers with her eye drops," and and he just had this voice off pat, and he would come up to me and he'd say, "I'm so tired. What are we doing today?" And all this, and I would come back to him and say, "I'm so sorry to hear that you're tired," and we'd become very Californian. And Matt is just a genius, and he can mimic kind of almost anybody. So also he would be able to be scurrilously imitating the makeup designer or the cameraman or whoever it was. And I loved working with him because he was very talented.
yes,
And he really cared about it. Like he'd rehearse and rehearse and rehearse, and he'd be on it, and it would annoy him if other people were not up to the scratch. By the time we did Totally Blue Peter, I mean, the other big issue with those kind of shows was they cost a fortune. So you had to find ways of, amortizing the cost. Now, Club Blue Peter was given a separate commission. So that money came from Nigel Pickard and it wasn't out of the blue. I think the Blue Peter budget had to contribute something,
yeah,
but we got this extra top up, which had made it possible. That didn't happen with Totally Blue Peter or Back in Time for Christmas, which were a couple of the other ones we did. That they had to come out of the Blue Peter budget. So with Totally Blue Peter, we made it two shows because that gave us the double whammy of spreading the costs, but
yeah,
also allowing us to have a cliffhanger. I thought, well, it's quite nice to have a cliffhanger. And that was, I mean, that was just hilarious doing that. And I kind of knew in my heart that probably it was the end of the road because they were so expensive and time consuming. And you had to be really dedicated. It was a lot of work on top of the day job. And I kind of couldn't see anyone coming up the ranks who had that same interest. There was a guy called Dermot who did The Quest, which was a serial within the show.
yeah,
And he did that brilliantly. And he'd have been a natural successor. But by that point, he'd moved on. And then as soon as I left, the budget was massively cut. So they could barely do the actual shows, never mind, frocking up and doing all of that stuff. But it was great fun. And I remember Steve writing to me and saying, we got a record number of complaints about Christmas and Club Blue Peter, but we also got a record number of compliments. And we got the second highest figure of all children's programs that year.
brilliant.
And so in the end, as Biddy would say, it's up to the audience. The audience decide. And Yeah, I've just remembered the other thing about Totally Blue Peter was that I wanted to find a way of getting Zoe to do her posh English accent, which I always thought was quite good. So I said, and I was thinking of Dynasty and thinking of Alexis and thinking, well, she could do that kind of big hair, television
Yes.
thing, and she'd enjoy that. And Gethin, he was very keen to do this sort of New York accent, and we actually made a film about him trying to, we piggybacked off another film he was making in America, but we did this film about him trying to kind of get the accent down. He never got it. It was terrible. And we used to say, what is that accent? That's kind of like, but it became part of the fun of it. And Liz was very good. She really was able to act almost anything you threw at her. And that was probably the last really happy time I had on, we were a happy team and it really gelled
Yeah.
and really worked. And it wasn't very long after that that a lot of shit hit the fan. And so I have very fond memories of Totally Blue Peter. And it was my era too. I was young in the 80s. So, that was the self-indulgent bit, but in fact, some of my clothes ended up being I'd kept various, so Gethin's spotty shirt and his
That was yours, was it?
leather jacket and his biker boots and his and the jacket he wore in the last number, which has sort of embroidery on the sleeves. I remember that cost £300 in 1987, I think, from a shop in Covent Garden. And I could never I've still got it. I wouldn't wear it, but I kind of couldn't
Oh,
quite
throw it
bring
away.
myself. It should be in the V&A. I mean, it's hand
Yes.
embroidered. It's a beautiful thing. And the costume designer, she was saying to me, it's actually quite expensive to do recent period stuff because you're wanting stuff that sort of is a little bit more exaggerated than the
Yes.
actual era just to make the point. And she came up with some great stuff. But when I said, well, I've got a few things that I've kept, and she said, bring them in. And I brought them in, and she was just like, these are brilliant and they're free. So, I can use them for nothing. And of course, the other problem was we're trying to recreate New York and Shepherd's Bush. And our editor, this was just before CGI, but he did some quite clever effects. And we mocked up a subway at the White City Tube with the right signage and stuff. And I think we got away with it. And of course, Matt, again, was so brilliant. He played this sort of Boy George character who had the Choose Life t-shirt called Rico. And I
I
mean,
remember.
I think I was pushing my luck there as well when he was kind of styling Gethin. And that was slightly an in joke because when Gethin got the job, I remember Matt being, oh, he's a male model, he's a male model, he's too good looking and all that. And so I was saying to Gethin, we're going to really go with the male model thing. That's what's you're going to be kind of this pop star slash model, and we're going to do all the looks we can think of. And we had a kind of brainstorming and said, well, what do you want? Oh, I want to do Top Gun, I want to do Superman, I want to do, and we just sort of went through the list of what most boys dressing up thing would be if they could. And the costume designer did that fantastically. And it was a really, really funny sequence. But yeah, quite tongue in cheek.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Okay, I'm conscious of your time. If we could just ask you a little bit about what your current thoughts are on maybe the future of children's television.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? That I think now, I mean, children are always the early adopters of tech. And so, in a large way, they've sort of already migrated. They've left the building. Certainly, the model that you or I would understand. And I have a lot of admiration for the people who've tried to fight very hard. Until recently, I was one of them, trying to kind of keep the rich mix of factual and entertainment and drama and all that going. But I think it's become steadily, steadily, steadily more untenable. And I think really the battle has moved from traditional television. I kind of don't really get why there are channels anymore. I sort of think the BBC should just grasp the nettle and say it's iPlayer only because the audience are just not watching things on the channel anymore, and channels cost a lot of money to run,
Yeah.
and there is not much money. I think it's a great shame that the drama offering has become really only practical if it's co-pros and international money, which means that inevitably, instead of it being the kind of contemporary drama that holds up a mirror to kids' lives, you've got Famous Five or Mallory Towers, and they're great quality of their kind, but they're sort of nostalgia stuff and they're very cozy. And I think they've made attempts to make, they put a character with a disability in Mallory Towers and things, but you're still fiddling at the edges of something. Whereas they would probably talk about, oh, we've got the dumping ground or whatever. But back in the day where you were getting 3 or 4 different serials a year, with British writers and all that, that's gone completely. And that seems to me a real shame. I think the battle really needs to move on to the tech giants, to the YouTubes and to TikTok and to area. You've got to be where they are. And if you aren't where they are, then, you're kind of King Canute trying to hold back the waves. And I think it's very difficult for public service broadcasting to do that because how do they get into bed with these commercial operators? The commercial operators don't need them, don't want them. They don't want more regulation. They're about making money and selling
Yeah.
advertising. So you've got a real kind of problem. As Anne Wood, who created Teletubbies, said to me when I was researching this book, she said, it's not that the enemies are at the gate. They're well and truly inside and smashing everything up. I mean, she said, that it really is. And her blame, and a lot of people would blame successive governments that haven't protected children's programs, British children's programs. They sometimes make a bit of noise about it, but they haven't done anything in regulatory terms or
No.
in fact, what they've done is dial back from it. They've allowed commercial channels to completely abandon their commitment to children's programs. And so we're in a pretty parlous state. And I think now it's down to parents more and more to curate what their children are watching and dealing with. And that's tough on parents. A lot of parents don't really know where to begin or how to do that. Um, and the competition is mainly with social media and phones. Then,
Yeah.
and I genuinely believe that 50 years from now, people will look back at the way we allow children access to smartphones in the same way that we now look at smoking and smoking among like young people sort of 50 years ago, which nobody was bothered about. And now everyone's like, what? You let people
Yeah.
smoke? I mean, it was a great message if you saw the documentary on Netflix, Social Network, about all the kind of creators of tech, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, all of them saying in a chorus at the end, there's no way I would let children have access to this
Mm.
stuff. And that's how I feel. But they have to have something. And again, if there's nothing that's tailored to them and their needs, and their specific children have got very specific needs, and they are desperate to learn more and desperate to engage and interact and all of those things. And so, although I think it's very difficult and challenging, I think it would be a great pity if people gave up. It's just we're in a kind of transitional stage, and I think there'll be a lot more bumps along the way. But
Yeah.
hopefully, the solution might lie in the audience. Sometimes it's the people growing up who realize there's a gap in the market, and because they understand that world. They're not like me, who's been dinosaur that went up through traditional television. They understand tech. They can do stuff in their own rooms
Yeah.
that's pretty amazing. And with I mean, AI is the other big game changer. AI might transform and might kill us all, mightn't it? But in which case there'll be no more problems. But AI could be something that, could, if used in the right way, could be incredibly empowering for kids' content. So there we go. It's kind
Yeah.
of gloomy,
Yeah.
grim in lots of ways, but there's always hope.
Yes. Hopefully. So I mentioned at the start about your books. We've got another one on the horizon. Are you allowed to give us any
Yeah,
sneaky peeks
yeah.
or a
No.
little bit of what's we all know what it's about, but
Well,
yeah.
it exhausts me because we haven't quite finished the editing stage, but it's a big brick of a book. It's 540 pages, and it's a history of the heyday of BBC children's programs from 1967 to 1997. And the reason for that timing is that 67 was when the department was reformed. It had not existed in the few years before that. And that's when they brought it back and began to be serious about children's programs again. And 1997, the cut-off date, is when Anna Hume left the job of head of
Yeah.
children's program. And after that, that job ceased to be a sort of long-term vocational job. It became a kind of revolving doors of people coming in and out, usually on their way somewhere greater in their career. And I mean, they were still, in some cases, quite vocational, but they weren't there very long. And that was also the dawn of massive competition, technological change. So that felt like the natural cutoff point. What followed was a sort of different story. And I confined it to kind of what was made within children. So obviously there are a lot of children's programs that weren't made by children. So Crackerjack, um, thankfully, Jim will fix it and Rolf Harris were never made by children's programs. Some of the drama, some of the Sunday classic serials, obviously Doctor Who, things that a lot of the general public would think of as children's programs were not. Ask
No.
Aspel was another one, Basil Brush. So they're not in the book. I don't cover those. I refer to them, but I don't cover them. But what I do cover, there's huge rich veins of everything from, Jackanory, Play School, a lot of drama, Grange Hill, Swap Shop, Vision On, Take Heart, Record Breakers, I mean, News Round, a lot of stuff. And I was lucky. And there's a sort of last chance saloon aspect to this because a lot of the people I was talking to were in their 70s and 80s, and some, and even their 90s, and some have died since I started the research. It was a long research period, and I did over 170 interviews and consulted a lot of archive material in a bid to make it as authoritative as possible, because I shouldn't think anyone else is going to go down that road again. And so I thought, well, I'm going to try and make this as comprehensive and detailed as possible. And also, it's always interesting when you can get at least two or three perspectives on the same thing. So
Yeah.
otherwise, it becomes a kind of unchallenged narrative. So I'm pretty excited about it, and it looks as though it's going to be a beautiful design. We've got some amazing photographs, lovely candid behind the scenes photos. There's a chapter about Blue Peter. I thought, what do we say about Blue Peter? I feel like I've written about every aspect of Blue Peter, but the chapter is called The Bronze Age, and it's about the period of 1988 to 1996.
Yeah.
Actually, it slightly goes on a bit further because it covers kind of Oliver too, because that was the era I hadn't written about. And I've had brilliant interviews with Diane, with Anthea, Tim, Stuart, Richard Bacon, Katie, really all of them, and Oliver and Lewis and John Comerford. So I feel like I've kind of left no stone unturned, and it covers a lot of really interesting stuff. I mean, Diane being the first black presenter, the pressure that she felt with that, Anthea coming in and feeling like, rightly, that they didn't want her there, and there was a lot of opposition to her, and how she turned that round. Stuart's sexuality, Richard's immaturity, I suppose. Katie, the whole wonderful rags to riches story that she has. Um, they're really good stories, and they're all very frank and funny, and luckily they're all in a good place. So that it's nice that they're looking back from that. And
Yeah.
Romana, I think, is the one that's probably the most poignant, because Romana, I was one of those who believed that Romana could have been brilliant, and become very popular. And I felt like, in a way, the guy who cast her and believed in her then left kind of 3 months after she joined, and that therefore she was on a hiding to
Yeah.
nothing. Um, but her story is really interesting, and that's all in that one chapter. And these chapters are big chapters. We're not talking about 5 pages. So I think it'll be a rich playground for people who are interested in that era and all the different personalities.
Looking forward to it very, very much.
Good, good.
Okie dokie. Now then, shall we end with a couple of fun things?
Yeah, go on.
So this week on the group, we've been voting on our fantasy summer expedition. I did give you a little heads up.
Mhm,
So we need to choose a location,
mhm.
3 presenters that you're going to send on the filming trip.
Why can't I have 4? I used to have 4
Well, you can
presenters.
if you want. Actually, 2 people did did
Oh, well, there you
that.
go then.
And then 2 pets to go and spend the summer with Auntie Edith.
Okay. Well, I remember that Edith very well. I used to type her dressing room card up, and I found out that she was married to her husband, who also helped look after the pets, was a former South American count. And then she told me this story, and I used to put the Contessa di Menezes on the dressing room card, and she loved it, because if you got on the wrong side of Edith, you could be in real trouble. You needed to be on the right side of Edith, and she was very funny. She'd sit in a corner in a nylon slacks reading a Mills and Boon, but she didn't miss anything. And I used to love those ladies. I used to say in another age they'd have sat round the guillotine knitting while the heads rolled. And I always loved that Leonie, who looked after the dogs, she overlapped with Edith. when Britney Spears came into the studio, we had all these American security guards with wraparound shades and microphones. I mean, really over the top, and they were trying to clear the studio. And I got a phone call in the office saying, we've got a bit of a problem because they're trying to get everyone out of the studio and they're being a bit bumptious and rude. So I came down and found the record company plugger and did my usual bollocking and said, Britney Spears is not so important that we couldn't find another item and get your people in order because they're causing a lot of offence. And I said, I don't mind clearing, there were some Gorpers and you got rid of those. And they've been trying to get rid of Leonie. And there she was sitting, kind of on her chair. And I said, her and the dogs are more important to us than Britney. We do not want to annoy her. So, that was very funny. But yeah, okay. So I did think about this, and it's quite true because when you're running Blue Peter, well, it doesn't happen now, but when the days when there was a summer expedition, it was a very big deal because you were committing to usually 4 weeks filming, and you wanted to contrast with where you'd been the year before. You wanted to go somewhere relatively safe where people weren't going to get killed or abducted. I mean, we spent some serious time looking into Iran. I was very keen to do an Arabian country. We looked into Saudi Arabia and Iran at a time when things seemed to be going slightly better, but not well enough. And we did end up we did Oman, but I didn't think Oman was strong enough for a whole summer trip. So
No.
we did a winter safari. I think that's what we did. And like in those days, we had enough money to go to other places in the year where you thought it's a great location, but maybe it's a half-hour special rather than,
Yeah.
summer expedition was two half-hour specials in my time and 6 10-minute films. Um, and obviously that was an expanded version of the earlier expeditions. So you needed somewhere rich and varied, but also you didn't want to waste a lot of your filming time traveling. So it was also trying, you didn't want, if it's going to take you 2 days to get somewhere, that's 2 days where you're not filming unless you make the journey part of the story. So there were so many logistical issues. So the first year, when I got the job, I was determined to do India because India has such a relationship with Britain, with the UK. And I wanted to all four presenters to go. And that was a lot of, I had to kind of dig my heels in because they got into a habit of not sending all four presenters. They would do two at the beginning, two at the end, and there'd be a bit of an overlap. And I wanted all four presenters to be there the whole time.
Yeah.
And Liz was pregnant, and there were lots of kind of issues about was it safe? And I was like, for goodness sake, women all over the world are pregnant. They work in paddy fields, they climb mountains, they do also, she's going to be filming. And Liz was very keen. Anyway, we got her doctor to agree. And that was the first one. And the second year, I wanted to do America, southern states of the USA. And another CBBC program was commissioned called Only in America. And I just thought we can't have that and Blue Peter doing, I didn't know what the crossover would be.
No.
So there was a kick, bollock, and scramble. And our very talented producer, Matt Jive, said, why not do Japan? And we did Japan and that worked. And then we revived the southern states of the USA. And then I wanted to do a Latin American country. So we did Bolivia. And that was my last one. I mean, I set that up and then left. But it was always a thing. And so I was thinking about this today and thinking there's still a lot of America that was never really been explored. I've just been to America and I spent time in Virginia and in Utah, which is an enormous state, and they have these incredible national parks and also incredible history. The whole story of the Civil War, the story of slavery. I think we touched on that because we had Andy as the first black male presenter when we went to the southern states. Yeah, and you want that kind of mix. You want the kind of bit of hard-hitting, serious stuff. You want natural wonder. You want adventure and action. And in America, what you also get every single time is amazing contributors because they just are, like when I was on this trip recently, it was really reminding me of Blue Peter because you go to somewhere and you'd get talking to someone and they would just be, you'd think you could so put a camera on this person straight away. There's no language barrier. Well, there is a bit of a language barrier, but there's a culture barrier more than a
Yeah.
language barrier. But also they do loads of big stuff and it's usually done really well. So, like when we went to this one place and there were these incredible alpine sort of it was like a cross between a bobsleigh and a roller coaster that you could do, and that would just have been an instant Blue Peter 5 minute
Yeah. I've seen
fun,
those. Yes. Yeah.
and And there were other things around that you could do, and there were sports you could do. There's rodeo, there's horse riding, there's loads. So I would probably go for Midwest USA, and that's a whole area that Blue Peter's never been to. And the presenting lineup, I would like to take my classic lineup of Connie, Simon, Matt, and Liz. Because the other thing is, when you're working with them for 4 weeks, 5 weeks like that, you need to know that they get on with each other
Yeah.
and that they all bring something different to the table, which that lineup really did. So you could put the two boys together, you could put one boy, one girl, all the permutations
And
worked.
it always worked.
It
Yeah.
always worked.
Yeah.
And, 'cause Connie was brilliant with kind of the quirkier, kind of dealing with odd, strange people and all the rest of it. Yeah, that would work for me, I think, that lineup. Um, and it's a bit of a cop out the States because that was always the argument when you went somewhere like that. But the other thing is it's very box office. Kids love it. I did a series for 10 years for CBBC called Our School, and we got very, very close to doing Our School USA. CBBC were really keen, and we actually lined up a school in LA, and we knew that the audience would be fascinated to have a fly on the wall documentary about an American high school. But it just couldn't quite reach the quality test, what they call the threshold for content that should really be reflecting children in Britain. So although it would have worked in terms of box office, for CBBC, it would be difficult to defend that they'd spent, 2 million quid on a factual show
Yeah.
that was reflecting the lives of American children. And that's a really good, just going back to what we're talking about, children's programs, the BBC can't just be commercial. That would have been a no-brainer. Let's do Our School USA. It'll probably do really well, but they couldn't do that because it would mean they get into trouble with Ofcom. So those sort of pressure.
Yeah.
Anyway, going back to the nirvana of planning a summer trip, the other thing is if you're going to be away for that length of time with people, you want them to be good people. So as well as the choice of the presenters, you have to choose the right crew,
Yeah.
and they become members of the sort of family. And it can be a dysfunctional family at times, but it is also where I think when you go out filming, particularly abroad, you get very deep bonds because you really are. It's like being in a band on tour, and what do they say? What happens on tour stays on tour. But in
Yeah.
a very benign way. So that was my answer.
Good. So before you open your envelope,
Oh yes, just remembered that.
so Abby from the current presenting team sends a love.
Oh, she's glorious. I love her. I love Abby. What a breath of fresh air she is.
Yeah, and she's
Gives me
always
hope.
she always speaks highly of you.
Yeah, well, it's a mutual admiration society. I mean, I don't see the program very often, but I do. I've seen enough of Abby to know she's the real deal, and I think it's so fabulous to have a presenter who, as Biddy would say, is she one of us? She
Yeah.
gets the program, and the program is different in lots of ways, but there are also core things that remain the same. And thankfully, she's there to be part of, of putting that over to the 21st century audience.
Yes. Okay, so at the end of each month, we award a crewmate of the month badge.
Oh,
So not as good as your gold, well, not as good as your gold, but
not real gold.
you've been made an honorary crewmate.
Oh, wow. Can I open it then?
You can.
I'm going to open it. Did Margaret Parnell make this? Oh, wow, look at this. This is so cool. Hang on. If I can get my ungainly fingers to open the packet. It's quite small. There we go. That is so cool. I'm very blind. It says, here's one we watched earlier.
Yeah.
It's probably out of focus.
No, we can see it quite clearly. Peter Purvis also has one as well.
Oh, fantastic. He's another. I love Peter. I think that Peter just is one of the greats. I mean, we know he's got mixed feelings about some aspects of Blue Peter,
Yes.
but I think what's good is that he's got a lot of love over recent years, and I think that's maybe softened him. He's realized that people did really rate him and liked him, and that matters. It's like they're all performers. They all want to know that there's an audience there for them.
So I don't know whether you noticed he started a new podcast
Yes.
Yes, so he was talking to Val on Monday,
Oh, wow.
and we could have listened to them all evening. In fact, I think there is going to actually be a part two. So
Oh, fantastic.
yes, so
I know
that's
that Val sometimes, because Val is a very idiosyncratic character, and she said to me not very long ago, I had an exchange with her about the new book, and she said, "Oh, do you think anyone's really interested? I mean, it's all been chewed over." And I was going, "Well, the whole point of this book is to not chew over." I said, "If I talk to you, it would be about Val meets the VIPs and special assignments and things." But I think she does get, she's living in Somerset, I think, in retirement. And she's always had many, many strings to her bow. So I think she's sometimes puzzled as to why people are still interested in her in a context of Blue Peter
yes,
Children's
yeah.
Program. Whereas, of course, to generations, she's one of the legends. She is a legend.
All right, Richard. I really, really appreciate your time. Sorry, it
Not at
took a
all.
bit of a while to
We
get
got there in the
connected.
end. That's the main thing. And thank you very, very much for my
Okay,
lovely badge. I really
okay,
appreciate that. I shall put that with my special collection of
okay. I
badges.
noticed you've got all the teams behind you. Is that?
I have. They
Yes,
keep an
yes.
eye on me as I'm doing things. So yeah,
All
it's
right,
it's a
Richard.
great
Take
thing.
care, and thank you
You
again.
too.
Okay,
Real
okay.
pleasure. Nice to
Bye-bye.
see you. Bye
Bye.
now.